It's the bird emergency. I'm Grant Williams, and if you're watching behind me, we've got a different logo. The Pint of Science Takeover. We're continuing our little run of shows, bringing scientists to the masses. I think that's how we're promoting it. Today, Toby Ross, who is studying at Deakin University, is joining me, and we're going to have a look at some seabirds, shorebirds, let me get that correct, shorebirds, some pollutants, and the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. Toby, how are you? Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm a bit cold, but aside from that, I'm pretty good.
Well, that's the price we pay living on the southern end of Australia, which, of course, is on the southern end of the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. Tell us what your project is, how you chose to do it, and what are the aims?
Well, I'll start with a bit of a context about the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. We're really lucky being situated here. I mean, you're right. It is definitely a trade-off. Sure, it's cold at the moment, but it's a great place to live when you consider that we're at the end of one of the most amazing migratory corridors that we have in the world. For people who are not familiar with it, it's a network of wetlands that extend all the way from down here in Australia and by extension New Zealand, all the way up the coast of East Asia, up into the high Arctic. And it's frequented by some 8 million shorebirds every year, many of which make this trip biannually. So they migrate between where they breed up north in the high Arctic, all the way down to here in Australia and New Zealand, where they spend their non-breeding season. Shorebirds, I've always found them quite fascinating, really. They're so diverse. You've got tiny little birds the size of maybe about a sparrow, a redneck stint, all the way up to something like an eastern curlew, which is the size of fairly good size, about the size of a duck, along the lines of that, maybe a bit bigger. And they're extraordinary. What was that? Sorry?
Longer legs, longer neck, and longer bills than a duck. And of course, you can look back in the archives. We've done a couple of programs about Far Eastern Curlews and the Eurasian Curlew, favourite of the show.
So what I've been predominantly looking at are more medium to small sized shorebirds. I'm looking at predominantly, so far I've looked at ruddy turnstones, Curlew sandpipers, and redneck stints. And these are just stunning birds to me because they migrate. It's amazing when you have a bird the size of, as I said, a sparrow, or maybe a little bit bigger in the case of the turnstones. You're holding this bird in your hand and you're looking at it and you know that this thing has flown a good 12,000 kilometres just to be where you are here in Australia. And to know that when you're holding a bird in your hand that could be 10 years old or something like that, and it's got a mileage on it of about pushing 500,000 kilometres, which we wouldn't rack up in our car in our lifetime. So it's just astounding what they do. So that's what really drew me to them in the first place. But the issues that they face, they're really a canary in the coal mine for a whole lot of global changes. When you look, there was a study I saw recently that suggested some 3% of global ecosystems are still intact. Global changes are really an issue that you see around the globe, particularly. But when you look at shorebirds, and they are so global in their span, even as individuals, the fact they can go from here in Australia all the way up to the Arctic, they really are a canary in the coal mine for any global change. And as such, we're actually seeing their populations really drastically decline. Some species like the Curlew sandpiper have declined by up to 80% in the last 30 years or so, up to 8% per year. So they're really quite in strife. And there's a number of reasons for this. Being so global, they pick up any of the issues from climate change, particularly when they're breeding up in the high Arctic. That's one of the areas where the effects of climate change are so extreme. You've ended up with a trophic mismatch. Normally, what would happen is these birds would fly up to the Arctic and they'd arrive just in time for the snow to melt, which is when they'd lay their eggs, and then they'd breed at a time where food is at its optimal availability. Unfortunately, with earlier snow melts due to climate change, you're seeing that these birds are no longer able to time their migration with adequate food resources. So you're ending up with juvenile birds that are malnourished and not able to survive so well, and potentially overall less survival as well. So that's one of the issues they face. Another of the main issues they face is the ongoing threat of land reclamation, particularly along the east coast of Asia, where you have one of the densest human populations on the planet. There is extensive land use there for industrial and agricultural purposes. And with this, the demand for land, we've ended up seeing in the last 50 years prior to 2010, which is a little bit out of date, but something along the lines of that. And we've seen about 2/3 or more of the coastal habitat that these birds rely on be destroyed. And so they're not able to, stop at these places that they need to refuel along their migration. This is where I come in, though, because with all this land use of that, particularly industrial and agricultural land use, you end up with increased levels of pollution that you see in the environment there. The pollution in particular that I've been looking at, the per polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFASs, which is certainly rolls off the tongue a little bit more. And the reason that we think these birds are particularly susceptible to pollutants is the fact, well, they're running a real gauntlet up the east coast of Asia. But also, if you consider the fact that they're birds that are migrating 12,000 kilometers, they've got a very high metabolic rate. So if you think about if you were to go and cycle a long distance and then have a beer in very quick succession afterwards, the effects would be pretty strong by comparison to if you were living a relatively sedate life. So we think they might be particularly susceptible to these pollutants in a way that a lot of other species might not be. And in this case as well, there's not a huge amount that we know about the pollution that these birds are experiencing. So that's really what drew me to going down the route of studying these shorebirds and the effects of pollution on them.
We do know that the PFAS chemicals quite deleterious. I mean, the Defence Department has had to change its practices and settle with some complainants in Townsville who were having their drinking water and just their living environment affected by PFAS, which was in a firefighting chemical that the Defence Department was using when they were doing their exercises to, obviously train people to put out fires and to attend to emergencies and whatnot. So we know that they have an effect on an animal as large as people. So it's a pretty reasonable assumption that they're going to have a pretty serious effect on a very small bird. And then it depends on the concentration that these compounds are being found, not only just in the wider environment, but in the food that the birds are eating. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Toby, but I think PFAS is a cumulative compound that I don't think mammals, and I don't know about birds, can actually synthesize or break down in our normal bodily processes and excrete. So I think the levels of these things build up and build up. Do we know what the toxic level is?
That's a difficult question. We don't know specifically. There's been some estimations for PFOS, which is the main PFAS. PFOS stands for perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. PFOS just rolls off the tongue nicer as well.
And I think that was in a whole lot of widely used herbicides. Like I can think of, I hope I'm not giving any misinformation, but when I was working in horticulture, I think we had a thing called triquat or paraquat, and I think that was pretty high in those compounds. I don't think they're used anymore in Australia.
Yeah. PFOS is one of the few that seems to have some kind of regulatory measures put in place because of the known effects of it. It's the predominant PFAS that we see issues with in a lot of wildlife and, as you said, even in human drinking water. So that's, as you said, it's predominantly in firefighting foam. And so it's particularly PFAS as a group. There's some estimates range between 3,000 and 5,000 different PFASs on the market for various purposes like textiles or paints or, as you said, in firefighting foam. And it's particularly the long chain, so where you've got a long string of carbon atoms in each molecule. Those are the ones that particularly bioaccumulate, which is where, as you said exactly right, the levels or the pollutants are not able to be broken down by any biological processes, certainly not in the animals themselves. And so you do see over time and a lot of these chemicals that these levels are increasing. So that's particularly when you consider that shorebirds are in a relatively high trophic level. There's very few things that are above them other than potentially raptors that might predate them. You really do see, well, we expect that we might see some severe levels of accumulation in these birds over time. So it's certainly something to be concerned about, yes.
And by inference there, all the raptors are going to be probably at risk as well. So we're talking about things like sea eagles and ospreys and I'm not sure, the fish eagles and things like that live along that Asian corridor.
Falcons get hit by it as well. Yeah. A lot of the work has been done on raptors, but not so much has been done on shorebirds so far, yeah.
Now, we'll keep going on the chemical aspect of your work a bit later, but you mentioned that land reclamation and we're generally talking about mudflats and marshy fringes, estuaries that are at risk. And Korea has been sort of in the target for its industrialisation of its coastal fringe and China as well. But we're certainly not so learned and acting in the best interests of our shorebirds here in Australia. We've got a development on the Toondah Harbour in Brisbane, which is putting a really crucial resting place for migratory birds at risk too. So I'll just bring that up so that we are not always pointing fingers northwards from here in Australia going, they need to do the right thing. And look, now's probably a good time Toby, for you to tell us that the flyway is not just a thing, a geographical space that the birds use. The flyway is now an organisation, a cooperative organisation of, I think, is it 39 countries?
I'm not sure on.
I think that's about the number, but it was formalised, I think, in 2006 with Australia being a founding partner in the partnership. It's actually called a partnership. So, of course, you've got all the major countries from Russia right down to Australia and New Zealand. And then I think every pathway nation is a signatory. So there's a lot of cooperation at that top level happening. There's some big corporates. Rio Tinto is one of them that's on board. And there's a whole lot of NGOs, obviously BirdLife International and all the regional subsidiaries are involved. And then lots of people like you, Toby, who are volunteering in other bodies like the Victorian Way to Study group. Now, you mentioned that you do the handling of the birds and that there's records of the organofluorides and the PFASs. You have to get that data from somewhere. So tell us what the methodology is to extract the data. How long have you been collecting it?
I'm actually very lucky. I've joined in on a very long-standing project of particularly catching birds here in Victoria, as well as on King Island, which is situated between Tasmania and Australia. Sorry, and Victoria. Tasmania is still Australia.
Yeah.
So the main method of catching them is through cannon netting, which is quite a dramatic procedure where you figure out where the birds like to roost, and while the tide's low or while the birds aren't there, you manage to set up cannons embedded in the ground that you have a net attached to the projectiles that when you manage to get the birds in the right place, you generally put markers out as well, so you know exactly where the safe area is. And so you can launch the net over the birds, and then that's how you capture them that way. And it's quite a well-organised procedure. It's really quite impressive to see how well it's managed when people do it. And so that's been going on here in Victoria for the last 40 years or so for banding. And then for the data that I'm particularly using, we take small blood samples from the birds when we capture them as well. So that's been going on for the last 10 years or so.
So there's a chemical analysis done from those blood samples. Is there a lot of, as an offshoot or a sort of ancillary analysis being done with genotyping so that you are building up a genetic database of the birds that are caught?
Don't think we've been doing that, no. Most of my analyses are also done we've got collaborators we work with over in Norway, and they're the chemists who are involved in the project. So we've shipped samples over to them, and they've been doing a fantastic job with all the analyses that we've been needing, which is brilliant.
So are they taking samples in Norway as well, and then you're able to compare? Okay, so you're only getting information from this end of the flyway, and obviously the Norway is not quite on the flyway. And it'd be really good to be able to compare different populations or different times, because perhaps up in Russia, the high Arctic where the birds are nesting, perhaps the concentration of these compounds is either not as high or they're different compounds.
Because we've actually, through partnerships along the flyway, we've actually got a number of samples that have been taken in Taiwan, so while the birds are on migration. And so that's actually one of the first things we've looked at there. I mentioned that I'm working with 3 species, but when we're looking at the samples from Taiwan, we have those 3 that I mentioned before: Ruddy, turnstone, Curlew, sandpiper, and redneck stint. But we've taken samples from pteric sandpipers, greater sand plovers, and grey-tailed tattlers as well. And so we've looked at the birds as they're on their migration one of the first things we did was we took the pollutant levels that we see in each of these species. And what we find, quite interestingly, is the species with the highest level of pollution, so Curlew sandpipers in this case, also happen to be the species that are declining fastest. So correlation doesn't mean causation, but it's certainly something to keep in mind there. And what we've then been able to do is we've got samples from Western Australia or Northwestern Australia in Broome, where there's a really big site for shorebirds there at the Broome Bird Observatory. And so we've taken samples from there as well, and we're from a very similar time on just either side of that migration. And we're able to see that these birds in Australia somehow have much lower levels than they do while they're in transit, which is really quite fascinating considering that these pollutants tend to bioaccumulate, or they appear to in other species. So it appears that there might be a means that they're able to clear it, or it could be. I do want to stress I am still quite early on in my PhD, so we've got a bit more data to come and bolster these stories. But it's interesting to see. Yeah,
that's what the work is for, isn't it, Toby? It's why you do it, to answer the questions. That would be positive if there was a way that these potentially lethal compounds could be dealt with in a biological process, even if perhaps the food that they are eating is somehow affecting it, and maybe it is able to be then shed as waste. Who knows?
We know that female birds in particular, over the course of a breeding season, do have the ability to sequester a certain amount of their pollutant load in their eggs, which in and of itself leads to other problems, particularly when you consider a lot of these compounds can then alter the hatching success of eggs as well. But so we know that females are able to secrete pollutant loads into the eggs as they produce those. We work with blood predominantly.
So can I just interrupt you there for a second, Toby? I hope that means the egg shell, and it's not concentrating like in the yolk sac or something for the chick to then be affected.
I'm not the person to ask about how it works in the eggs, unfortunately, but I do know that PFASs can, in some studies, it appears that they do quite up to 20 or 30% reduce hatching success at certain levels as well. So it's certainly a concern.
Definitely. So let's talk about the cannon netting a bit for a minute. How many of you in a team at one time to successfully carry out a session of netting? That sounds like it probably needs quite a few hands on deck, perhaps more than the traditional mist netting methods.
Yeah, I think mist netting substantially more passive. I'll say that, where you just let the birds, head into the net themselves. But with cannon netting, in my experience, it's tended to be at least 10 people or so, because not only do you need all the people to set it up, but you've got twinklers, who are the people. It's a really wonderful name, twinkler.
Are they the rich people trickling down the wealth?
No, they're the ones who are out there actually moving the birds around. There's a real trick.
How does that happen?
Oh, you have to move in a way which means the birds see you and move slightly, but not in such a way that they feel panicked and take off and fly, because that's what you really want to avoid. So I've been on one of the field trips. I was the twinkler, and I was on the radio, and I had someone from higher up where they could see me. I couldn't see the birds, and they were just having to direct me. So it was almost, I felt like a player in a video game, being directed where to walk and then having to drop down when the birds were alerted to me.
5 degrees left, Toby, 5 degrees left, 5 degrees left.
Exactly that, yes.
What are the special skills for an expert twinkler?
I certainly don't have those skills. In my case, it was just being able to listen to directions and know what my left and right was. So as well as the twinklers, you have someone who has to have nerves of steel sitting there, ready to fire the net when the birds are deemed to be in the correct position and all are going to be safe. But on top of that, once the net's been fired, I haven't had anything to do with the actual organisation of that. So far, I just do what I'm told, which is a very important thing when you're working with cannons. And
how noisy is it when it's let off? And by extension, how much do the birds get stressed by the experience?
We generally try to minimize the stress to the birds. There's a certain time frame which we have to have them processed and released again for ethics reasons and welfare. But the cannons themselves are quite loud, but it's generally it's one bang and then the cannons are out and over the birds. There's a whole lot of different size nets. I can't off the top of my head remember the size net we use, but once it's gone off, everyone converges on the net. If it's a hot day, the first thing you do is pull a shade cloth over to keep the birds from overheating and keep them safe. And when they're covered, they're a lot less stressed. And then you have people who have a lot more experience with extricating the birds from the nets, because that can be fairly complicated. Usually it goes very smoothly because the net's just gone over the bird and the bird's sitting there. But then you have a system of runners where we've got these really nice soft cotton bags that you place the birds in. That's nice. You have to be pretty quiet around them, but you've got the birds in an enclosed space in the bag. And so you're running them back and forth consistently, just keeping them moving to make sure that none of the birds are being left behind, and you very systematically roll the net back bit by bit.
And then what's the process? They're put in the bag from the net, and then a runner is like the gaffer or the best boy or something on a film set is racing off to who? To a bander, or is the serum taken first?
The first thing we do is we set up holding pens. So the catches I've been on, because I'm helping with the blood sampling, the banding itself takes place by other people. So you've got different teams of people who are working through the birds. So you have lots of simultaneous happenings, particularly on the Victorian mainland. We have fairly decent-sized teams of people. I've only been to a couple of catches, only a couple of successful catches, because it's not always. Sometimes you'll go out there and you'll spend weeks sitting there. Yeah, we've had days where the birds are all sitting perfectly in front of the net, but there's so many of them that you're sitting there going, the birds need to stay safe, we can't fire. So there are days where you have the birds perfectly catchable, but if there's a chance that even one of them could get injured, you can't fire. So those are funny days where you sit there and go, the birds are perfectly there, but that's how field work goes. But yeah, we have a whole lot of holding pens that we set up with nice shade cloth, that we have a certain number of birds per thing, so we can put them in there, get them away from people, get them out of the bags. And then from there, you have people who will systematically bring birds from the holding pens to the people who are banding. And then once they've measured the birds, so you take measurements like the tarsus length, you take the bill length, you weigh them, you put a band on them, you get ideas. If you can sex them from the plumage, you tend to do that as well. And then from there, they'll go to us who are doing the blood sampling and swabbing. We do the biological samples. They do a lot more of the other people tend to do a lot more of the measurement samples. And for the overall, that phenomenal 40-year database that's been worked on by the Victorian Wader Study Group and other organisations.
And do you know much about the system of ringing so that the birds can be identified by all the volunteers as they move north and then back again south down the flyway path?
I'm not too familiar with it, but I know that depending on where the bird was banded, they'll have a different coloured ring or a different coloured flag on their leg. In Victoria, I believe it's an orange flag that the birds have on their legs. But one thing as well that we do, that you can identify not just where the bird was banded, but in a lot of cases, we actually put engraved leg flags on the birds, which if you have a scope or binoculars, you'll be able to see it. Generally, it's a 3-letter combination on the leg flag of the bird, so you can identify that bird without having to catch it and see it in your hand and read the band on its leg.
And that means if it's been caught in different locations, it can be a flag that can be engraved saying it was caught in South Korea in this year, and then another one might say it was caught in Siberia or in Cambodia on a different date, a different location. So you can reduce the amount of stress the bird has to experience, but still collect really meaningful data. Now, how about data logging? Is any of the birds that are being captured in the teams that you're working with, are they fitting transmitters for the fantastic mapping that is being done nowadays?
Yes, the main device that we use are known as geolocators, then they rely off they're able to detect the light at any point in time. And so they're comparing the light level at any point in time with the time base. You're able to use that data. I'm not quite sure how it works. It's a phenomenal amount of work that goes into it, but it's really quite fascinating. And they use, based on the light, so periods of light and day, particularly when they're migrating, you can determine, comparing it to that time base, you can determine where the bird has gone over the course of its migration. So there were wonderful, tiny little things that are attached to the bird's legs. And one of what was a really interesting thing a number of years back that was found is that they can use the geolocators as well. Because once you get up to the Arctic, particularly in the Arctic summer where you just don't have nights, it's just 24-hour day, you can end up seeing still these periods of light and dark in these birds, in the geolocator track, And in that case, it's because the bird has been incubating. If it's sitting on a nest, obviously it's sitting over its geolocator that's attached to its legs. And so that'll be dark in that case. And so it's been quite amazing. Not only can you use those geolocators to determine where the bird's gone over their migration, you're actually able to see whether or not that bird was successful at breeding that year as well. So that's one of the major priorities that people in the group have, is to put these geolocators and regain them back. Some of them you can get 2 years worth of tracks off them pretty easily. And so it's quite amazing that as well. Lots happens in a catch.
So if you're listening and you're interested in this kind of data, I would suggest having a look at the East Asian-Australasian Flyway Partnership website and also the various study group websites, because some of the animations that are available from the data is just phenomenal. I'm a huge fan of the New Zealand bar-tailed godwits data that I keep seeing. I'll obviously leave some links in the show notes and on the website so that people can easily find those. Toby, when you're doing any kind of research, you need to start out with a couple of questions at the outset. So what are the questions that your work is asking? And you're only early on into it, but what have you found out so far? What has your investigation told you?
So one of the first things we wanted to do was firstly just kind of get an idea of what the pollutant levels that we're seeing in these birds are and see how the different species are polluted. And that's what we found from that, from the data, particularly from Taiwan, are seeing when you've got 6 species, those that are declining fastest seem to have the highest levels of pollutants. But that led us then to also look, because we had so many samples that have been taken here in Australia, we were looking within Australia and comparing the species, particularly to see any of those patterns of bioaccumulation, both amongst and within individuals. So when we're looking across, one of the things we found when we're looking across species in Australia, we're actually not seeing, when you're looking amongst individuals, across the species, we're not actually seeing much of a pattern of bioaccumulation. You have some birds that when they're sampled have particularly high levels. Others tend to have not quite so high, but there's no real pattern there that we're seeing of older birds having higher levels of pollution, which is quite interesting. With all the work that's gone on with ruddy turnstones on King Island predominantly, we've actually managed to get a database where you've got individual birds that have been sampled multiple times over their lives. So you can have a bird that was sampled first as a juvenile, the year it first arrived in Australia. A lot of these shorebirds, when they migrate south for the first time as juveniles, they'll spend another year or two just, relaxing, recovering from it, staying a year or two in Australia or New Zealand. But then in the case of these turnstones, we've managed to get samples. There are birds that we've sampled at age 0, and then we've sampled them again at age 7 or 8. And so you can really get a good idea of just the individual variation of pollutants. But what's really interesting, particularly in the turnstones, because we're able to look within individuals, so far, we haven't seen any evidence of bioaccumulation in these birds, which is potentially good news. One of the things we found in the turnstones is that they are very clean when it comes to the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. We haven't looked at any of the other pollutants yet. We're hoping to go down the route of looking at the more classic pollutants like heavy metals, but for now, we've just looked at PFAS. But it's really interesting to see that despite the fact that these chemicals are known to be bioaccumulative, we're not really seeing it in our birds, which is really interesting. There could be a number of reasons for that. For example, there's certain levels of variation that can be seen based on what the bird's eaten. So there is a certain amount of noise around each value that you'd get, a certain amount of error. But they're also able to, as I mentioned about the eggs, they're able to also get rid of pollutants through in their feathers. So feathers are in other studies, feathers are quite often used as a pollutant level marker. But just because, even across our species, just because we're not seeing any bioaccumulation, and that's good news in and of itself, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're out of the woods, because if you think about consumption of alcohol with people, we are able to break down alcohol, but it's still a toxin to us. And if you were to take, it's the exposure that's the concern here. And if you were to take, say, yourself without touching alcohol and then compare you to a self who drank, I don't know, a litre of scotch every other night, there'd be a fair degree of difference between the health of the two. So just because we're not seeing bioaccumulation doesn't mean it's still not an issue.
And Toby, I'm guessing that if you model it on human behaviour and the outcomes of increased toxicity, there might be problems with breeding behaviour.
Yeah, potentially.
Some of those ruddy turnstones might not be able to quite get the job done.
The turnstones are probably, based off the data we've got, the turnstones are probably not the ones we'd be as concerned about, because part of the reason, I should clarify, part of the reason we chose these 3 species, where you've got the red-necked curlew sandpiper and ruddy turnstone, is they're fairly representative of some of the diversity you see in the shorebirds of the flyway. Turnstones, easily the biggest of the 3 that we study, but they tend to prefer really rocky coastal habitats. So that's why we go to King Island, because an island situated in Bass Strait is never going to be not windy and never going to be not rocky and rough. So they prefer those habitats where there's not much of an opportunity for things other than kelp to accumulate on the coast, which is what they flip over and find all the hoppers and all the food under there. But when you're looking, what we found in our birds that we have here in Australia is that the birds that prefer the habitats that are sedimentary. So you're looking at mud flats and the inland coastal areas like Port Phillip Bay and Western Port Bay. Those birds are substantially more polluted than the ruddy turnstones that prefer the rocky coast. So that was part of the reason why we chose them, is because of the different habitats. They prefer the lovely, soft, muddy stuff that feels great between your toes, but smells a little bit if you've ever been on a mud flat. But between the Curlew sandpipers and redneck stints, the redneck stints are so tiny and they have that small little bill that they tend to forage largely in the surface, whereas a Curlew sandpiper will be seen up to its belly wading in water. So there's a bit of difference there.
Okay, couple of questions based on what you've told me. Approximately how old do each of the species get to? What is their average lifespan that you know of?
I would, just thinking of the ages that I've seen, probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years on average. But we do have birds that get up. Redneck stints, for example, there's one sample that I'm going to be looking at that was from a bird that was known to be at least 16 years old. So they can live for a fairly long time. And in a period of time, they can pick up a lot.
I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, the bird's the size of my mouse, and as you mentioned, and there are stints that fly from New Zealand to the very top of Siberia. And then if it's a female, they're producing the eggs, laying them, incubating. It's cooperative breeding, isn't it, for stints? So you've got a pair that are doing the feeding and the caring for the chicks. But then they've got to eat enough to fly back to southern Australia and New Zealand. And you're right. They are just phenomenal birds. I mean, I've always been amazed with how the curlew does its journey, and then the shearwaters and the albatross and whatnot as well. But they're substantially bigger, and they're eating, bigger fish and whatnot. What are stints eating? Because they're so small.
I haven't done any foraging work on stints. My master's before I started my PhD was looking at foraging in bar-tailed godwit, so I appreciated you mentioned them earlier because they're just stunning birds as well. But stints would be going for, at least in New Zealand mudflats, for example, there's a lot of tiny little mud snails that live on the surface, but in the mudflats you've got all sorts of other little invertebrates like amphipods and things like that. So there's plenty around.
But so we're talking about those really little snails that you sometimes see on plants in aquariums or whatnot. And what about things like those sandhoppers and whatnot? Are they too big for the stint? Are they more for the next size of bird?
There's a fair bit of size variation within the sandhoppers. I would imagine that they'd probably eat them if they got them. They're not. I'm not sure specifically about what they eat, but I know that ruddy turnstones definitely eat sandhoppers. Some of the concentrations of hoppers in the kelp I've seen on King Island have been astounding. You pick up a handful just of hoppers. It's quite amazing, also a little bit gross, but it's delicious if you're a shorebird. So I'm not sure specifically about the stints though, sorry.
That's okay. I'm just a bit off track thinking about how they fuel themselves up, because I'm thinking the larger birds like the curlew sandpiper eating, the things we classically associate with mudflats, and as you said, they're wading out to their underbellies. So there's the same things we use for bait when we're fishing.
Worms would be in there as well.
Yeah.
You've got real soft worms that dig in the soil, because that'd be a pretty good food for a stint.
And little crabs. And all those kinds of things. So, yeah. So I've got you sidetracked. I'm very good at getting sidetracked, Toby. You probably haven't determined anything really yet, but what are your results leading you to think that you may cover that you weren't expecting?
One of the really interesting things we've found when we're looking within the samples that we've got in Australia, I mentioned that the birds that forage in mudflats, so you've got the curlew sandpipers and redneck stints, they tend to be substantially more polluted. What we've found, though, is even here in Australia, there seems to be a major site difference. When you're looking at birds at Western Port Bay, which is largely surrounded by agriculture, and then so you've got those birds, and you compare them to the birds that we sample at the Western Treatment Plant in Werribee. And what we find is the birds from the Western Treatment Plant, which is probably not surprising, the birds that are in the poo ponds are substantially more polluted, or can be substantially more polluted than the birds that are on a much cleaner beach around a paddock. So that's one of the things we've particularly looked at. And anyone who's familiar with birding has probably encountered the fact that poo ponds are a great place to see birds. They really just seem to gravitate towards water treatment plants because of the sheer amount of nutrients available. So what that's led us to look at is, particularly considering that there appears to be higher pollution levels, we wanted to then look at okay, do these high levels of pollution that we're seeing in these birds, do they then influence the survival of the birds? And so with the 40 odd years of sampling data that's happened across both of these sites, we've looked at, we've made a comparison of the survival. We've run survival analyses looking at both adult and juvenile survival across both sites when you compare the dirty site at the Western Treatment Plant with the Western Port Bay, which is substantially cleaner in many cases. What's been really interesting, despite the pollution difference that we're seeing between the two sites, we're not seeing any major difference there in the adult survival. The adult survival seems to be much the same at both sites. The difference that we are seeing, though, is that the juvenile survival is very different. In the Western Port Bay, the birds that are in those marginal, they can be more polluted, but the ceiling seems to be higher for the birds from Western Treatment Plant.
Can I just clarify too, Toby, on Western Port Bay, you mentioned there's some variability. Where are you sampling on Western Port? Are you doing French Island, Turin and Warneet? Are they the kind of locations? Or are you going round to the other end to Coronella and whatnot?
Sorry, not Turin, a bit out of, I think, Curlew.
Yeah.
So right at the north end of the bay, that area around there is where a lot of the sampling's being done.
So not the Hastings and sort of side where there's a lot of industrial work, you're doing the agricultural side.
Is the Hastings area, is that where there was the talk of building was it a natural gas storage plant or something?
Yeah, and Hastings Crib Point, and there's also Lysarts and whatnot, but there's also runoff from the tip and the township of Hastings, and it's that side is far more industrialised rather than where you're talking about with Curlew. But then again, there's all that agricultural dairy land, and there's also some food production up there that I think empties out into the bay as well. So there's some, that's not right on the fringe of the bay, but I think their waste products end up in the northeast of Western Port. One of the reasons that the Pint of Science takeover is so good, Toby, is it introduces the sort of methods and the opportunities for people who want to undertake a career in sciences. Of course, we're looking at biology, the earth sciences, ecology, conservation in general. Now, you mentioned that you'd been down to King Island, a fantastic location.
Oh, stunning.
Will your work in this project, because you've got a couple of years still to go, do you think it'll take you anywhere else along the flyway, maybe to Taiwan, maybe to the high Arctic?
There's a possibility. It depends, obviously, the state of the world, but beyond the PhD for sure, definitely, I'd be really interested in that.
And money's always an object. I mean, I look at risk of time dating our conversation, Toby. The federal budget has just been announced here in Australia, and it's continued the reduction in government investment in biodiversity and understanding conservation. I think in real terms, the reduction for projects such as your own is a reduction of about 50% in sort of 6 or 7 years. In real terms, even though the dollar amount sometimes looks the same, how far it will go has been reduced. So again, we always point our fingers up to China. China need to do more. Well, I'll wear the shame of being an Australian who is part of a society that does not take any of this stuff seriously. People like you do, Toby, don't get me wrong. I'm not painting the academic community and the research community in a bad light, but fair income people, it's time to start voting for the environment and toss out the clowns who just aren't committed to it. They do not care. They've shown us that for years and years. So that's the end of the political statement, Tony. But I think we really need to ramp up the aggro when it comes to how we deal with this. People have just, the Franklin River only flows free because people got very active and very angry. And I think we've reached a point where if we're going to save not only these birds, but the habitats and, frankly, the quality of life that we all live, time to act. Anyway.
I'm glad you said that, because I told myself I'm not going to get political. So I'm glad that was from you, not.
Well, Toby, one of the benefits of doing a podcast where you don't receive any money or any support from anybody is you can say what you bloody well like. And, I'm really happy that Rio Tinto are supporting the work of the Flyway. But so they bloody well should. The corporate entities who extract the resources and damage the environment and profit from it should be returning some of the profits to work that preserves the natural environment for everybody. And we say words like natural environment and it all sounds all airy-fairy, but I believe we're at a tipping point, and I think we need to really think about every time we consume something, what is the effect? Now, surely you notice when you're out in fieldwork the amount of just mess that we're leaving. And people aren't doing it on purpose. It washes down our roads. It washes down the drains. It washes off the farms. It comes in every windstorm that we have. Stuff is everywhere.
It was always amazing to me. I used to volunteer on there's an island just out of Auckland in New Zealand that's called Island. It's a wonderfully clean island. It's a phenomenal success story in terms of replanting the island and reintroductions of native species. But it was always interesting being there after a storm. You have these lovely pristine beaches a bit north of Auckland, and then after a storm, the beaches were just covered in plastics and all sorts of rubbish and things like that. So it's quite astounding. And you're dead right. It's not deliberate. It's not people necessarily going, it's just our system of, we just have a lot of rubbish. We just make a lot of it. It ends up everywhere.
But it's also allocation of resources too, Toby. I mean, we're getting a bit off the track, but I think we need to start to understand that everything's connected. Nobody wants to pay any tax, so we reduce the amount of parks and gardens guys and council maintenance guys emptying bins. So bins overflow. People use the bin, but it's full, and people are conditioned to drop something on a full bin and it spills over. The ibises will then turn up, or the seagulls or the crows or the currawongs or whoever, or the cats or the dogs, and they're foraging through and rummaging around and they spread it around. So because we don't any longer have enough people taking the rubbish away when people do the right things, it ends up in the environment. We don't have a proper recycling industry in Australia, so we're just stockpiling all this stuff. We used to send it to China, and China said, no, we're not going to take it anymore. But we're not developing industries to reclaim the materials that we have already produced and taken from the earth. You know, it's a deliberate choice. Industry does it. Every single business does it. You know, if you don't recycle your printer cartridges, you are making a choice every time. If you are using single-use containers when you buy takeaway food, you are making a choice and you are part of the problem. We've all got to turn it around. So anyway, I've got a bee in my bonnet about it.
It's a very valid point to make.
Yeah. Sorry, Toby, go on. Shut me up.
Right. Yeah, wanting to talk about a potentially positive thing, considering the impact that we're all having. As I mentioned about the wastewater treatment plants, they are an absolute magnet for not just shorebirds. I remember I spent a bit of my early teen years living in California and going birding in California, and always going to the wastewater treatment plant. They even had a flamingo turn up there at one point. I did a skip in the zoo, but everything seems to gravitate towards them. So it was interesting to find that the adult survival is not too different, but the fact that they're a magnet for shorebirds and other birds as well, it means we've actually got an opportunity, provided we manage them in a way where the pollutant levels are minimal. The birds they're not being attracted to something that'll kill them. We actually have, it could be a unique opportunity to, particularly just the world over, if we manage our wastewater, for example, you can come up with these nice, potentially new habitats for these birds if we do it properly, because otherwise you're making a magnet just that gets them sick. Whereas if you can manage it in a pretty good way, we've got an opportunity to create really, I hate to use the phrase, kill two birds with one stone, particularly on a bird emergency podcast, but we've got an opportunity to both deal with part of our own waste, as well as provide really valuable habitat to species that really need it.
Mate, you're allowed to take a linguistic risk anytime you like, Toby. You're always welcome to live on the edge here, mate.
Dangerous analogy to use.
Yeah, well, if you can come up with a less appropriate one, feel free. I'm not going to stop you. I think let's wrap up your project work before we go into the next part of the show. Is there anything else that we've missed in terms of the importance of your work?
I'm hoping that because we don't really understand the extent to which these shorebirds are affected by pollution, I'm really hoping that by examining this, we can actually kind of come at conservation strategies with another arrow in our quiver, because we're getting an idea of the effects of climate change, which is kind of everyone needs to pull their weight in that one. But then when you're looking at land reclamation, both here in Australia and all the way along the Flyway, we've got a fairly good understanding of that and how that's affecting them. But if we can add I feel that the more that we can understand the threats that these birds face, the better chance we actually have of, particularly through lots of collaboration with people all the way along the Flyway, you've got a really good opportunity to actually make some meaningful difference. Because if what I'm studying here, I find out and go, okay, these birds, pollutants are not the big issue for these birds, then that's also good to find out as well. A negative result is still a result. But the fact that we are seeing some birds with high levels of pollutants is concerning. So if we can address that as well and use that to inform conservation policy going forward, that'd be really wonderful.
And just reinforcing that even though you're studying birds that are not critically endangered, but the populations are reducing, there's a sandpiper, the spoon-billed sandpiper, which is tenuously clinging to existence. And if there's any way that you can model or that you can make assumptions to help in the management of that species, well, then that's going to be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also, just because species might not be critically endangered now, as I said, with the Curlew sandpiper, that the population's reduced. 4 out of 5 Curlew sandpipers that would have been in the population, they might not necessarily have lived the 30 years, but the fact that it's reduced by 80% in the last 30 years is, we want to really try and prevent them from getting to that kind of level.
That's right. And what we have to keep pushing out to the policymakers, to the decision makers, to the money men at companies like Rio Tinto, money needs to continue to be spent on this, or else in 10 years' time, when I'm talking to Dr. Ross about his continuing work with shorebirds, he'll be saying, yeah, we haven't actually seen a Curlew sandpiper in the Flyway for the last 3 or 4 years. Nobody's seen one. We haven't caught one. We don't want that to be the story.
There are cases where, the thing is, changes can be made in those circumstances. If you look at, for example, the use of DDT, which was, I think it was used as a pesticide.
Well, 2,4-D. I mean, the condor, the peregrine falcon, the osprey are all birds who benefited from a change in the way we applied chemicals and what was available. They're fantastic success stories. Yeah.
As well. The last 10 years or so, I think the population's tripled, which is astounding considering that they were so endangered in the 70s. It was a real low point. That's when they banned DDT. It's tripled just in the last 10 years. You got over 300,000 either individuals or pairs. I'm one of the two.
Well, when I was a secondary school student, the peregrine falcon was teetering on the edge. It was a rare bird to see in Australia. The Peregrine Fund was established and all sorts of lobbying and pressure was undertaken. And now I've got 2 peregrine pairs live near me in suburban Western Melbourne. You know, it's a fantastic success stories. And I think we forget how much work it took for every one of those activists to keep the issue in front of people. You know, the EU particularly active in banning all sorts of compounds. And if that spreads over to then the US market, well, then if you can just get China, you know, that's most of the problem of the world for a particular compound can be eradicated. But it takes energy. It takes research, it takes knowledgeable decisions, informed decisions, but it takes energy from just normal people.
Yes, absolutely. There has been some progress made in the case of the PFAS that I'm looking at. PFOS was officially designated as a persistent pollutant in 2009, and one of the major producers in the world of PFOS, the 3M company, they've stopped using it. So that's a good case of big companies stepping up and making a difference. Unfortunately, there are still 3,000 others, but it's a start. Well, the changes can be made.
We've got to celebrate the little wins, Toby. We've got to celebrate the little wins. Big tick to 3M. Big tick.
Absolutely.
All right, let's kick into the second part of the show where we talk about Toby. You just mentioned totally unprompted that you went bird watching as a kid in the States and that you traipsed around as a bit of a birder in New Zealand. So when did you realise that you were one of those strange kids who was going to know all the names of all the birds and, you know, you'd be at a barbecue and someone's telling you something really interesting about rugby and you go, oh, Tui.
That's way too close to home because that's what I'm like.
We've all been there, mate.
It's a good way to be.
Gee, was that a hobby? Wow. Sorry, mate. Keep telling me about your amazing car.
Been about 10 years old. It actually wasn't until my family, we moved to California, because it was just quite astounding to move to California and just see the sheer variety of birds that they had there. In New Zealand, we've got astounding birds, but by comparison, the numbers are just not quite so high in terms of the number of species that you'd see, say, in the city. But it was over in the States, and I think a real turning point, especially for shorebirds for me, was I think I would have been about 12, and at our local stormwater pond, I watched a killdeer, which is a plover species over there. I watched a killdeer lay an egg, a wild killdeer lay an egg, and I was pretty hooked from then. I was fairly firmly ensconced in birddom at that point, but to watch that was that was a real turning point. Going, yeah, I think this is where my life's going to go, working with birds.
So, Toby, were you that nerdy kid with a sketch pad lying down on the lounge room floor while your brothers and sisters are watching shows about trucks or war movies and you're sketching out? I actually remember sketching out the redneck stint and getting one of my parents to correct me on my Latin pronunciation.
It's definitely, I don't know about truck and war movies, not quite that.
Or listening to gangster rap, who knows? But,
I was definitely the kid lying on the floor drawing. It was definitely something I did a lot of. It was actually through drawing that I really kind of started paying attention to birds in the States, is when I started getting into that. Yeah. Just before I turned 15, so a good 12 years ago now.
And was that back to New Zealand?
Yeah, back to New Zealand. And it was a pretty great place to move to, considering that the vast majority of New Zealand's wildlife is birds and reptiles are what we've got. So it was really cool to get hooked on birds and move to a country where we've got some astounding ones.
And you've now got a really active, certainly public sector, going for predator-free New Zealand, like trying to eradicate all of the pest species that were introduced over the period of colonisation. But it seems from afar that the community is really involved. It looks like your activism in plastic pollution and whatnot in New Zealand is a lot higher than it is generally here. Would that be a fair summation?
Possibly. I'm not one to speak to that particular dynamic, but I know when it comes to the pest control side of things, it's something that you, as a New Zealander, you grow up kind of understanding the unfortunate thing that not all of the animals you see around you are ones that are meant to be there. And so you kind of, I love living here because I can see a possum and I can look at it in a tree and go, you're beautiful, you're a possum, I can love you, as opposed to seeing a possum in New Zealand where there's a bit in the back of my mind going, oh, you should die.
Now, possum pie is actually a thing, isn't it, in New Zealand?
Not that I'm aware of, maybe previously. I've never met anyone who's had it, or I know there's been the odd campfire story about it around the place.
Yeah, it's sad to think that rainbow lorikeets, brush-tailed possums and magpies, the enemy in New Zealand.
Possums especially are a real problem. But yeah, it is such a nice change, though, just from a perspective of someone who is utterly enamored with animals. I don't understand how you couldn't be. You've always got something to look at if you appreciate animals, but it's really nice being somewhere where you can appreciate them, because it is quite sad when you think about all these animals. Unfortunately, the necessary thing is we need pest control. That is just how it works. But it is. I can imagine it would be a weird thought coming from a perspective where they're just around and they're what you're meant to have.
Yeah. Toby, when you're out doing your field work, what's your field guide of choice?
I've actually just switched. I was using the Pizzy field guide. It depends on the country as well.
We're talking Australia. We'll talk about New Zealand in a second.
I've just switched to I think it's the new one, the Australian Bird Guide by Menkhorst and Rogers and I think Clark.
Yeah.
And then the magnificent artists who have put all the work into the sketches in there. It's phenomenal. I think they're beautifully drawn birds and there's plenty of information and it's really nicely easy to read.
Are you using the app?
Which app? And if the fact I'm asking that probably means no.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fair guess. Now, I'm just going to get mine because it's just called Oz Birds on my screen. Morecambe and... Where are we?
The Morecambe, I know the one. Yeah. I was introduced to that while I was on King Island and I haven't quite tempted to get that. I've actually been using Cornell Birds have the Merlin app.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? All the Cornell stuff is amazing. Yeah. What's the field guide you're using in New Zealand? Now, before you answer, when I was a kid, one of my aunties spent a number of years living in New Zealand and she gave me for Christmas, do you remember that little series, volume 1 and 2 of the Birds of New Zealand that had this spiral bound spine? It might be a little bit before your time, so Yeah, so I used to, while I was drawing my redneck stint on my sketchbook, I was also going, oh, I'd love to go and check out the double-banded. So what's your New Zealand field guide?
It's I've got it right here in the shelf. It's the Heather and Robertson one. It's the one I've tended to use, but there's one that's quite newly done, which is by Schofield and Stevenson.
Now, which one's got the inventive title of Birds of New Zealand?
One of them is the Field Guide to the Birds of New Zealand, and the other one is Birds of New Zealand. So they're both up there. You don't ask any questions about what's in them.
Exactly right. Okay, well, you haven't taken on the apps yet. That's not your go-to when you're out in the field. But what's your favourite or most needed piece of equipment when you're out?
Has to be a pair of binoculars. I've just gotten a new pair. It's a pair of Nikon. I can't remember the name specifically, but a pair of binoculars is fairly universal in any kind of field work, if just to locate the birds, particularly when you're working with turnstones and they all just blend into the kelp on the rocks. You pick up the binoculars and all of a sudden you're seeing the little busy birds everywhere. But yeah, so a pair of binoculars has to be number one. Oh, the people who I work with who are in shorebirds probably hate me for this. It's because it's not a shorebird. Not sure if you're familiar with it, the particularly the North Island weka. It's a large flightless rail we have in New Zealand.
Like a halfway between a crake and a swamp end kind of thing.
Yeah. It's like it's a buff banded rail that someone's gone and inflated.
Yes. You're going to like the episode. Actually, here we go. Time dating and all that kind of stuff. Before your episode goes out, there's going to be an episode featuring Scott Mowat, who has done those documentaries on the kakapo and the takahe. Yes. So another episode for you to catch up on. Toby, future Toby, you can go back and listen to that in the past. Why the weka?
I actually first encountered the South Island ones just on a camping trip with family, and I thought they were hilarious. Watching this bird steal our bread bag, which we had to nick back from it and put it up on a table, and just it was sitting there clearly planning, trying to figure out how it could nick it off the table. But I spent a number of years ago, I spent a summer working as a ranger on Rotorua Island, which is another island this one used to be owned by the Salvation Army. It was a rehab facility turned nature preserve. And so that island has a population of several hundred weka on it. And I spent the summer working there doing a lot of grounds work. And I just thought it was hilarious. I'd be going along cleaning up gardens and things like that and being followed by a weka that was promptly picking up everything I chucked back into the garden back out on the path. Yeah. Just wonderful characters.
Yeah, they have a personality. And I think for people in Australia, if you could cross that juvenile ravens, I don't know if you've got them many of them down in Geelong, but if you crossed a juvenile raven with the bin chicken variety of the ibis, I think that would kind of equate to a weka. They're really inquisitive.
Opportunistic as well.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of where I place them. Now, I haven't seen them in the wild, but I have read and watched a lot of weka stuff because they're pretty cool. We used to have them in some of I think on Lord Howe, I think, and Norfolk, I think.
Rail species, I think.
I think they predate colonisation, but I think that they were there. I was looking up the IUCN extinct birds and I saw some wekas. So, yeah. Where's your favourite place? And you've been quite a few places, Toby. Where's your favourite place to go birding?
I have to think about that one.
You can.
Probably either in the Saguaro National Park in Arizona. We have the phenomenal, almost around that area, you have the collision of birds from Central America and a lot of the desert birds of North America. But I think probably one of my favorite places I've ever been birding was early morning in Lassen National Park in Northern California, where you have all of the migratory warblers in the trees and the willow trees around the lake. That was pretty stunning. Every time you pick up your binoculars, you've got some different colored bird.
Yeah, I don't know how closely you watch bird Twitter and the bird photography hashtag on bird Twitter, but the warblers and the buntings and whatnot that people are posting at the moment as they are going through their migration is just astounding. The variety, the number of species is it's eye-opening. It's
every single color combination you can think of is on some little bird.
Yeah, it is. So that would be somewhere I would like to go, Americans notwithstanding.
A lot of them are wonderful people.
Well, I mean, 47% of them at the moment, mate, are fair. What's your bucket list place? Where have you got noted down for where you really want to go to look at some little feathered friends?
I think Colombia and Ecuador. I think when you get to the northern reaches of South America, where they supposedly have 1/5 of all bird species on the planet, I've had many a dream of going there, and it's still very much top of the list.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think around there getting into some pretty decent rainforest, and probably not being able to see anything because they all be up the top of the trees, but to be able to try would be awesome.
Well, you can set yourself up with some ropes and some pulleys and get up there into the cloud forest. I think that would be pretty amazing.
I love the live bird cams that Cornell does. So they have the Panama one, and I tend to watch that during my breakfast a lot of mornings. That
Very
kind of a
cool.
person, apparently.
One of the kestrel cams at the moment is really interesting. I just saw the kestrels hatching this morning. That was pretty cool. Couldn't tell you if it was I couldn't tell you if it was in Britain or if it was in the US, but I think kestrel cam is a US one. Peregrine's in Melbourne. There's just so many. So Toby, what's your life number?
Oh, you mean number of birds, I assume?
Yeah, thank God you weren't able to just reel it off, mate. I still haven't interviewed anyone who can.
I started listing at 13 just out of interest, just to see what I could say. I think I'm somewhere in the low 800s.
Very good.
I mean, I don't twitch, but I do enjoy, out of interest, finding out what species I've seen.
Well, for anyone who's jumped into the podcast and hasn't got a clue what we're talking about, the bird nerds sort of occur on a bit of a spectrum. And at the extreme of one end are the people who can tell you how many different species of birds they've seen in their life, like that. They'll go 742. And I got a lifer yesterday, and the lifer is one that they had never seen before. And they'll also tell you about how far they drove last weekend to go and see something that had turned up in a rare bird report. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is me, who hasn't looked at a list for forever. And I'm always meaning to enter data onto an app, but I'm just too busy watching what the bird's doing. And I think Toby's just a little bit back towards the fanatic. He's
certainly closer to just sitting and watching birds, what they're doing. I'll quite happily sit and watch a sparrow do a sparrow things.
Yeah. Now, what about photography, Toby? Do you do any?
Part-time. I've got a little point and shoot. I guess super zoom bridge cam. I don't know what the terminology is, but I've got a point and shoot with a decent and you just get lucky occasionally.
Yeah.
I'd love to get more into it. So that's definitely on the life list of things to get more into, because I do very much enjoy it when I get out.
Now, often people I talk to who are into shorebirds or seabirds couldn't live without a spotting scope. Have you got one?
Not myself, no. It's a bit beyond my price range at this point in my life, but it's certainly fairly high up the list of things. So when I'm gainfully employed and I say that, when I'm in the workforce as opposed to a PhD student, I'll put it that way.
So it's on your wish list, and you've told all of your family you'd really love one for Christmas.
I've been saying that for a few years. It hasn't happened yet.
Very good, very good. Well, if there's any benefactors out there, Rio Tinto, this guy's working on the Flyway, and you're a partner. Maybe someone from Rio Tinto can stump up for one for you, Toby. Let's see if we get lucky. We'll put it out there. Toby, it's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.
I'm very happy that the people at Pint of Science put us in touch. You, Toby, have a standing invitation to come on the show anytime you want to update us with your work, or bring one of your colleagues on, whatever. I think it's important work you're doing. It's not the glamour end of the sort of conservation world. Shorebirds brightly coloured, and they're not easy to go and see, and not easy to do a press conference with one in your hand saying we've just done this. So yeah, anything I can do to promote the work you're doing, Toby, I would be happy to. And we really want to see you when you're Dr. Ross, when you're about to defend your work. You can come on once we know that your testament is in the bag, so to speak, one of your little soft cotton bags, probably, and come on down. And I hope that you really do develop your skills as a player.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Pint of Science. It's pintofscience.org.au, I believe. If I'm wrong, as they say, down below in the show notes, I'll certainly have the link there. Check out, dig a little bit deeper, find out what the science is that's going on within the community. And if you're interested, if you can, get involved in a citizen science project and follow the work of people like Toby. It's going to be increasingly important as we move ahead in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, if we've got that long. Here we go. And now, Toby, if people do want to keep a track on, sorry, I'm a bit doom and gloomy. Reading the reports of what's not being done at the moment it's depressing. But where can people follow you, Toby? Where would you like them to look you up?
Probably best to go through the Centre for Integrative Ecology, various platforms with Deakin. I'm a bit of a dinosaur and I currently have next to no social media presence, but I'm thinking I might have to change that now you've been talking to me about bird Twitter.
Well, but the people give Twitter such a bad rap. Bird Twitter and academic Twitter and all the conservation stuff. It's the only way I can keep up with what people are doing. I guess if I was an ornithologist in a university in an office and that was what I did all day, I could probably keep up. But no, it's great seeing the really interesting work people are doing, the successes people are having around the world, and the citizen science projects that are going on. That's what I really love following, seeing how, well, one of the mottos for my show, Toby, is that you can't do everything, but you can do something. So just go out and do something. That's what I implore everyone to do. Start with checking out pintofscience.org.au. And of course, you can't follow Toby, but you can check out all the work that's happening at Deakin University. And you can follow me at Bird Emergency on Twitter, or you can just check out the website, subscribe to the podcast. That's as active as you have to be today. Thanks very much. Toby, thanks again. We'll see you next time. I'm Grant Williams. Goodbye.